There is a man who, for decades, the internet decided simply could not die. And for a long time that felt harmless, funny, even. The jokes came easy, they spread fast. They turned into something that felt, in the strangest way, almost like belief. Somewhere along the way, the line between the legend and the actual human being behind it stopped being visible at all. Then one morning, millions of people woke up to headlines that stopped them mid-scroll. The rumors moved the way bad news always does, faster than facts, louder than corrections. Some said he was gone, some said he had been quietly declining for years. Some said the martial arts icon, the action hero who had outlasted entire generations of Hollywood, had finally reached the end that the jokes always promised would never come. The distress was real. So was the confusion. And underneath both of those things, there was a question that nobody had quite thought to ask before all of this started. Who exactly is Chuck Norris, not the myth? Not the meme, the man, because nothing about his story has ever been as simple as the image, not his childhood. Not the quiet, grinding way he built himself from almost nothing into one of the most recognized names on the planet. Not the private battles that unfolded far away from cameras and headlines. And certainly not what his life actually looks like today, behind the version of himself that most people think they already know. The jokes were always the easy part. The truth is something else entirely, something slower, something heavier, something that once you actually look at it changes the way the whole story feels. Ryan, Oklahoma, 1940. A town that most maps barely bother to include, set beneath a sky so wide and flat it almost feels like pressure. This is where it begins, not with promise, not with signs of things to come. Just a small, struggling family, a father who was gone more than he was present, and a mother named Wilma who worked herself down to the bone to keep what little they had from disappearing entirely. Carlos Ray Norris came into the world with almost nothing, and the world, for a long time, did very little to suggest that was going to change. He was a quiet child. Shy in the way that kids from hard homes sometimes are, guarded, watchful, not given to drawing attention. He struggled at school, he did not stand out. There was no moment in those early years that pointed toward what was coming, no hint that this particular boy, in this particular forgotten corner of Oklahoma, would one day have his name spoken in languages he never learned and recognized in countries he had never visited. The story at that point looked like it was going nowhere remarkable. When he was a teenager, his family moved to California, a small shift, the kind that barely registers at the time. But sometimes the smallest pivots carry the most weight. You only see it clearly when you look back from somewhere you never expected to be. At 17, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. Part of it was practical. Part of it was something harder to name, a reaching toward structure, toward discipline, toward something that might give shape to a life that had felt, for too long, uncomfortably undefined. He was sent to South Korea, and it was there, thousands of miles from Oklahoma, stationed in a country he knew almost nothing about, that something shifted inside him for good. He found Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art that demanded everything: precision, patience, ego left at the door. He trained with an intensity that surprised the people watching him. He earned his black belt. And then, instead of stopping the way most people do once they have the credential, he kept going. Deeper, harder, further than anyone expected. He came back to the United States with something he had not carried before, a sense of direction that did not depend on anyone else's belief in him. He opened a martial arts school, then another. Then several more. He competed seriously, built a real reputation in a world most Americans barely knew existed, and did all of it with his head down and his expectations quiet. He was not looking for fame, he was just working. The only way he had ever really known how to do anything. What came next surprised everyone, including, by most accounts, him. By the time the wider world started paying attention to Chuck Norris, he had already been building something serious for years. His martial arts studios were running. His competitive record, including multiple professional middleweight karate championships, had earned him genuine credibility in circles that took the discipline seriously. He was not a celebrity. He was something rarer, a craftsman, someone who had mastered one thing completely and was now quietly working on the next. Hollywood called. And when it did, he treated it the way he had treated everything else, not as a gift, but as a craft to be learned. The early film work was modest, small parts. Supporting roles in projects that nobody would build retrospectives around. A lot of people take that kind of work, feel underused, and walk away. He studied instead, watched how sets operated. Understood that the patience required in a sparring match was not so different from the patience required in a career. You absorb, you adjust. You keep showing up until the moment arrives that you are actually ready for. His friendship with Bruce Lee mattered more than people often realize. They had trained together and respected each other genuinely, the way two people do when they share a dedication that most of the world does not fully understand. When Lee cast him in Way of the Dragon in 1972, it placed Chuck Norris in front of an international audience for the first time. Lee died the following year, a loss that hit the martial arts world in a way that still has not entirely faded. But the film had already done its quiet work. People had seen what Norris could do on screen, something in him registered. The years that followed were a slow, deliberate accumulation. Breaker, Breaker, a force of one. Films that were not trying to be art and knew it, clean stories, clear heroes, endings that felt earned. In an era when the country was navigating a particular kind of cultural exhaustion, he gave audiences something uncomplicated, and they responded to it in numbers that caught everyone off guard. Including the studios. Missing in Action arrived in 1984, Code of Silence followed, then Delta Force. By the mid-1980s, Chuck Norris had crossed a threshold that very few people ever reach. His name had stopped being just a name. It had become shorthand, a symbol, a cultural shortcut for something the world seemed to need. His face appeared on posters in countries he had never been to, next to text he could not read. Then Walker, Texas Ranger landed in 1993 and changed the scale of everything. 8 years. Dozens of countries, a generation of viewers who grew up watching it on Saturday evenings. In a television landscape that was becoming increasingly comfortable with moral ambiguity, Walker did not flinch. It stood somewhere firm and clear, and an enormous number of people found comfort in that. They still do. The show runs in syndication to this day, in markets that would surprise you. Alongside all of it, he was also building something more durable than fame. Total Gym, the fitness brand he endorsed for decades, became one of the most successful home fitness products in television history. His martial arts federation continued to grow. He invested. He built branded businesses rather than simply lending his name to things. He was smarter with money than the public image ever suggested, quieter about it, more careful, more deliberate. It looked from the outside like something that might simply keep going forever. The cracks, when they came, arrived from a direction that nobody had prepared for. For most of his public life, Chuck Norris kept a careful distance between who he was on screen and who he was at home. He talked about faith, about discipline, about the values that had carried him from Ryan, Oklahoma to wherever he happened to be standing. What he did not talk about, what almost none of us talk about until we have no choice, was fear. The specific, suffocating fear that comes when the person you love most is the one who is suffering, and every tool you have ever developed in your life turns out to be useless in the face of it. Gina Norris became seriously ill in 2013. It started with something that looked ordinary, MRI scans, as part of routine rheumatoid arthritis screenings. She received multiple injections of a gadolinium-based contrast agent, the kind used routinely in imaging procedures around the world. After the third injection, according to her own account, her body began to respond in ways that terrified them both. Severe burning sensations that did not stop, cognitive difficulties. Pain so constant and so consuming that there were moments, she has said, when she genuinely was not sure she was going to survive it. The months that followed were, by every account they have chosen to share, the worst period of their lives. Chuck Norris stepped away from public life and became her full-time caregiver. The man who had spent decades being the constant, the one who always came through, always held the line, always walked away from the wreckage standing, was now sitting beside his wife in medical facilities across multiple continents, watching doctors struggle to understand what was happening, and feeling something he had very little experience with. Helplessness, real, complete, undeniable helplessness. They traveled for treatment, spent years searching for answers. The financial cost, which Norris has discussed openly in interviews, reportedly climbed into the tens of millions of dollars. Most families confronted with that kind of figure would have been broken by it. The wealth he had spent decades accumulating was now moving quietly and urgently toward one single purpose: keeping his wife alive and as intact as possible. When they went public with the story in 2017, he spoke about that period with a rawness that felt unlike anything he had offered before. He described watching Gina deteriorate. Described the particular weight of loving someone through something you cannot fix. Described crying. Chuck Norris, the man whom an entire generation of internet culture had collectively decided existed outside the normal parameters of human suffering, sitting in an interview and describing what it felt like to cry beside his wife in a hospital room. It landed on people differently than almost anything else he had ever said publicly, because it was true in a way that roundhouse kicks and action sequences never quite are. They eventually filed a lawsuit against several pharmaceutical companies involved in producing the gadolinium contrast agents. According to reports, the case raised serious questions about informed consent and whether patients had been adequately warned about potential risks. Questions have been raised, and the matter remains legally and medically complex. No widely reported final resolution has fully settled the case, and no official conclusion has been publicly reached in a way that closes it cleanly. The details, according to reports, remain contested. What is not contested is what the experience did to him privately, the Walker era, the cultural peak, the mythology. All of it had ended not with any visible collapse, not with scandal or failure, but with something much quieter and much more human. A man, aging and wealthy and still famous, sitting in a foreign hospital wondering if the woman he loved was going to make it through the night. That is not the Chuck Norris the jokes ever prepared anyone to think about. The internet has always had a complicated relationship with Chuck Norris. Long before anyone was seriously worried about his health, the platform had already built something around him, a mythology so robust and so widely circulated that it became its own cultural artifact. Separate from the actual person it was supposedly describing. The Chuck Norris facts. The endless chain of jokes about his physical impossibility, his immunity to pain, his apparent defiance of every known law of nature. It was absurd, it was affectionate. And it lodged itself so completely into the collective memory of a generation that people who had never watched a single one of his films could perform the bit without hesitation. But that mythology left behind an unusual side effect. It made an enormous number of people superstitiously, almost personally invested in his continued existence. And so when real concerns about his health began to surface, or even when vague, unverified rumors surfaced without any factual basis, the reaction was outsized, dramatic, often completely disconnected from what was actually happening. Multiple times across the past 15 years, claims spread across social media that Chuck Norris had died. Every single time, those claims were false. But they moved with the speed and the authority of verified news, reaching millions of people before any correction had a chance to catch up. News organizations published clarifications. Representatives issued statements. The cycle became almost mechanical. A rumor would appear, spread, generate genuine distress among people who actually cared, and then slowly dissolve as the reality reasserted itself. It happened more than once, more than twice. The question sitting underneath all of it is a real one. Why does a false story about this particular person travel so quickly, with such confidence, and with such stubborn resistance to correction? Part of it is the internet's comfort with dark irony. A Chuck Norris death rumor carries a kind of comedic perversity that makes it shareable, at least for the moment before the facts arrive. Part of it is the genuine tenderness that a specific generation feels toward him, an anxiety about watching someone they associated with permanence and strength move through the natural, irreversible process of getting old. And part of it is simply that Chuck Norris went quiet enough, for long enough, that the silence itself became material for speculation. When someone who was once everywhere gradually becomes somewhere else entirely, human nature fills the absence with its darkest available scenarios. It happened during the years of Gina's illness. It happened again during the stretches when he simply chose to live privately on his ranch in Texas, rather than maintain any kind of active public profile. Absence for a figure of that scale reads as evidence of something. According to the most recent credible reporting, Chuck Norris is alive. He is in his mid-80s. He has spoken about his faith, about Gina's slow recovery, about the life they have built on that ranch in Texas. Quieter than before, more private than most of his fans are comfortable with. But present. Still here, the gap between the myth the internet assembled and the reality of a man navigating his 80s is not a tragedy. It is just time doing what time does without asking permission from anyone's expectations. But the rumors did something beyond simply misinforming people about whether he was alive. They pushed a different question to the surface, one about money, about what had actually happened to the fortune he had spent a lifetime building, and about what, after everything, was actually left. Estimating Chuck Norris's net worth is genuinely complicated in ways that most celebrity financial profiles never have to be. At his peak, the numbers circulating publicly ranged widely. Various financial outlets across the years placed his net worth somewhere between $50 million and $100 million, with some estimates pushing higher still. A significant share of that came not from film royalties, though those were real and ongoing, but from the business infrastructure he had built carefully alongside his career. Total Gym, the home fitness brand he had endorsed and helped develop across decades, became one of the most successful infomercial products in television history. The Walker Texas Ranger residuals, from a show still airing internationally in syndication, represent a revenue stream that most people outside the entertainment industry do not think to factor in when they try to calculate these things. He invested, he retained intellectual property. He built branded businesses rather than simply renting his name out passively. He was financially careful in ways that the image of a roundhouse-kicking action hero does not immediately suggest. Then came Gina's illness. And the figure that entered the conversation, reportedly over $30 million, spent across years of international treatment, changed the way people thought about where his finances actually stood. He did not frame it as a loss. He has spoken about it with a directness that is almost disarming. The money existed, it had a purpose when it was needed, and he used it. That is the entirety of the reasoning, at least as he has chosen to present it publicly. There is no grief in how he talks about it. There is something that sounds more like clarity. But the questions it leaves behind are real ones. A fortune built across decades, partially redirected toward a medical emergency that no amount of financial planning could have anticipated or fully absorbed. What does that leave behind? And maybe more importantly, what does the willingness to spend it reveal about how he has always understood wealth, not as an achievement to protect, but as a resource? Something that only matters in relation to what it can actually do when it is actually needed. The legal dimension adds further complexity. The lawsuit against the pharmaceutical companies involved in Gina's treatment was not a minor filing. It drew significant attention and raised broader questions about patient safety, about informed consent, and about whether the risks associated with certain medical procedures were being communicated adequately to the people undergoing them. According to various reports, the legal process has been extended and complicated. No final, widely reported resolution has defined the case in a clean way. Questions have been raised that, according to reports, remain without a definitive public answer. The matter, in several important respects, is still open. What does appear clear is that Chuck Norris, whatever his current financial position, emerged from that period as a different version of himself than the one who entered it. The ranch in Texas. The deliberate privacy, the reduced public presence, these are not the behaviors of someone in embarrassment or decline. They read instead like choices made by a person who looked carefully at what he had, weighed it against what he valued, and adjusted without apology. That kind of recalibration is rare. And it almost never arrives without a cost that most people would not have chosen to pay. There is something quietly uncomfortable about watching a cultural icon age in the era of the internet. For most of human history, famous people were allowed to age privately. They could slow down, retreat, change, and the world would continue to encounter only the fixed version of them. The films, the photographs. The performances that lived on in circulation, independent of the person who had made them. The image stayed still even as the actual human being kept moving through time. The internet dissolved that. Now the distance between the image and the reality is visible to anyone willing to look. And for someone like Chuck Norris, whose entire public identity was constructed around a kind of superhuman permanence, that distance is wide enough to produce a genuine collective dissonance. People encounter an old man living quietly on a ranch in Texas and find themselves struggling to reconcile it with the figure that lives in their cultural memory. The mind wants to hold both versions simultaneously and finds that it cannot quiet, but something important gets lost in that dissonance. The man on that ranch earned what he has. The beliefs, the discipline, the faith that has anchored him publicly for decades, none of it is costume. People who have known him across different chapters of his life have consistently described someone whose public values and private behavior are unusually aligned. Across an unusually long stretch of time. That kind of consistency is rarer than it sounds. Most people perform more than they realize. His politics have been visible and at times divisive. His Christian faith has shaped his public statements in ways that some people find deeply resonant and others find difficult to sit with. These are real parts of who he is, and any account that pretends otherwise is doing its subject a disservice. He is a specific kind of American, shaped by a specific generation, carrying specific convictions that he has never pretended to be uncertain about. You may agree with him or not. But the coherence is genuine. His children, his marriage to Gina, the life they have built together, these are what people close to him describe as the actual substance of who he is. Not the championships, not the box office numbers, not the financial architecture, the relationships. The way he showed up day after day during the years when showing up was the hardest thing available to him, he still writes. Has authored multiple books on faith and on what he understands as the foundations of a life worth living. He maintains a quiet public presence. He makes occasional statements on issues he cares about. He is not gone, he has simply stopped performing his presence for audiences who expect constant visibility. That is not the same thing as disappearing, even if it sometimes gets reported that way. The death rumors, when they resurface, are interesting in what they reveal about the people spreading them. There is a grief running through those stories, not always acknowledged but there. A grief about time. About the slow erosion of the figures that a generation grew up associating with certainty and invulnerability. Watching Chuck Norris age means confronting something that the jokes were specifically designed to protect everyone from confronting. It is not really about him. It never entirely was. It is about the part of all of us that needs certain people to stay permanent. And the slow, reluctant work of accepting that permanence was never something anyone was actually offering. Sit with the whole picture for a moment. Not the highlights, not the mythology, the whole thing from the beginning. A boy in a broken home in a town so small it barely registers. A teenager who discovered, entirely by accident on a military base in South Korea, that there was a discipline powerful enough to reorganize him from the inside out. A young man who came back to a country that did not particularly know he existed and started building something from nothing, one school at a time, one fight at a time, one refusal to stop at a time. There was no inevitable arc here, no destiny that was going to deliver him to where he ended up regardless of what he did. Every step was chosen. Most of those choices were invisible to everyone watching. That story, stripped of the noise, the irony, the accumulated cultural weight of 4 decades of memes and jokes and marketing, is a genuinely remarkable one. It is not the story of a man who was always going to be great. It is the story of a man who decided, in the absence of any particular reason to believe it was possible, that the circumstances he was born into did not get to determine where he was allowed to go. He made himself over and over again, with very little acknowledgement and absolutely no guarantee. And then when most people would have considered the hard part finished, when the career was built, the wealth accumulated, the legacy established, he was asked to do something that no amount of training had prepared him for. He was asked to step aside from everything he had built and simply be present, to be a caregiver, to sit in rooms he could not fix and beside a person he could not cure and just stay. To spend the resources he had accumulated not on a final act of public ambition, but on the quiet, unglamorous, exhausting work of keeping the person he loved as whole as possible for as long as possible. He did it without apparent hesitation, without the kind of resentment that would have been understandable, at least in anything he has chosen to share. That might be the most significant thing he has ever done. More significant, in the terms that actually matter when you strip everything else away, than any championship he ever won or any film he ever made or any business he ever built. The internet version of Chuck Norris cannot be hurt, cannot be diminished, cannot be touched by anything the world has the capacity to produce. That version was always a projection, a shared fantasy about what total invulnerability might look like if you gave it a face and a name and let it keep winning forever. The real one can be hurt. Has been hurt, has carried grief and fear and helplessness that the projection was specifically designed to make impossible. Has come out the other side of all of it quieter, more private, and by most available evidence, more genuinely at peace than the version of himself that was everywhere in the years when everyone was watching most closely. There is something worth sitting within that. Something about what strength actually looks like when the audience is gone, and the only thing left is the truth of who you are in the room you are actually in. The legend will outlast the man. That is how legends work. But the man, the actual, specific, complicated, faithful, flawed, determined, genuinely human person, is far more interesting than anything the legend ever managed to capture. And he is still here. If this story made you pause, if something in it landed differently than you expected, leave a comment below. The name Chuck Norris carries so much noise around it that the real story barely gets heard. What part of this surprised you most? And if you found something here worth your time, subscribing keeps more stories like this coming, quietly, carefully, one life at a time.